Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Liberty Hangout podcast. My name is Justin, and I'm the founder of libertyhangout.org. Tonight, we have another heavyweight debate between two very formidable opponents. Standing in the yellow corner, representing Never Johnson, is Chris from Liberty Hangout. And in the red, fighting for Team Gov, is Calvin from the NYU College Libertarians. Gentlemen, since this is the first time that either of you have appeared on the show, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourselves to our audience here?
I guess I'll go first. I'm Calvin Tran. I'm a film student at NYU. I'm also a Students for Liberty campus coordinator, and I'm on the e-board for College Libertarians here. Yeah, that's all about me.
All right. I'm Chris John Cox. I'm the co-founder of BeingLibertarian.com. I'm no longer with them for reasons I'd not like to get into, but I am also a writer and a contributor at the Libertarian Republic. I have written articles that have been reposted and shared on Julie Borowski's page, Matt Kibb's page, Peter Schiff's page, and many others. One of my articles was shared as a repost and credited to me on Alan West's National Center for Policy Analysis. I've been shared on the Young Cons as well. I worked as a campaign consultant in my state that I live in, as well as a policy director for several local campaigns. And I have my own blog. You can go follow me on Twitter at I_ANCAP. And I've recently started contributing to libertyhangout.org. So that's me. You can follow me on those sites as well, and you'll see my articles on libertyhangout.org if you're interested.
All right, awesome. So in just the past week, there has been a lot of contention surrounding Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party presidential nominee, since just this week alone, he said that he would guarantee Mitt Romney a spot in his administration. He came out in favor of a carbon tax and mandatory vaccinations before changing his mind, and a few days ago coming out against them. So the resolve here tonight is whether or not it is still a wise idea to support Gary Johnson for President of the United States. Now, tonight's debate will feature 5-minute opening statements from each participant, followed by 5 lightning rounds. I'll be keeping time, and this sound here will mark a 30-second warning. So good luck, gentlemen, and to our viewers, we encourage you to stay active in the YouTube chat, and if there's time at the end, we'll be taking questions from you guys. So here we go for round number 1. You will each get 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and we will start here with Chris. Chris, why is it not a wise idea to still be supporting Gary Johnson for president?
Well, I have to disagree with the verbiage of that question. I don't think it was ever a wise idea to support Gary Johnson, even during the primaries. The first straw that kind of, I was open to Joe Overrun, but the first straw to me was the whole Burke debacle that he had that kicked off his campaign. I wasn't really for or against him, but that's really what started to make me question it. And then slowly, the Bill Weld situation, the bake the cake thing. I know I'm going to get crap for that in the Gary Johnson crowd, but it's true. Freedom of association is a core tenet of libertarianism. And then, slowly after he got the nomination, you could see he's not a unifying figure. At least all these people who said, well, we've got to support whoever the nominee is. Well, why wouldn't you support someone who you could get everyone to like instead of just Gary Johnson supporters? Aside from that, I'd say it's not really, unless you're in a swing state, it's not really a good idea to spend too much time supporting the presidential nominee, whoever it is. I mean, you can like Austin, or you can like Darryl Perry, you can even like Gary Johnson, but spending all your time campaigning and sign waving, like for me, I'm in a heavily blue state, so it'd be a complete waste of time and energy to support Johnson, because it doesn't matter who I support. In the presidential election, they're sending a Democrat to the Electoral College. So if you really want to spend time and energy supporting the Libertarian, don't support Johnson. Even if you like him, support someone local who's running, or consider running yourself. Because, in my opinion at least, supporting someone who is barely a Libertarian just because they're the party member and you don't even like to necessarily is a waste of your time. It's a waste of money and resources, and it could be going to someone who you could actually influence the results in the election, like a city council candidate or a Senate candidate even, if you really want to support someone and make a difference. But just, spending all your time and energy on Johnson, it would be nice to get a Libertarian in the presidential seat, but I just don't feel like we're there yet, especially with someone who doesn't look like they're going to get in the debates. We should really be focusing on things like city council or county supervisor or even Congress if we're feeling bold, because those are elections where the local support matters and local policy can be influenced. But Johnson, in my opinion, is just not worth the time at this point.
Does that conclude your introduction, Chris?
That does.
All right. And Calvin, why is it still a wise idea to support Gary Johnson for president?
Well, I'm not going to act like I know everything. But what I will say is, Libertarians, they have really three decisions this coming election cycle. The first one being to, I see them as being embodied by three people. The first one being Ron Paul. Ron Paul, if you check out his channel and whatnot, he's still talking about libertarianism in the sense of trying to keep it a politically, its own separate idea. He does not want to get involved with the election. He'll make pot shots at Hillary and Trump and all that. He won't endorse Gary Johnson. He's trying to keep it a separate philosophy. He wants it to be preserved as a separate philosophy and enter our political realm as a philosophy on its own. The second choice would be what I think Rand Paul represents. That is, he's vocally supported Trump, him and Thomas Massie, and most of the Republican Liberty Caucus. They kind of are edging with Trump. Because they want to pick up the pieces of a GOP party that is, after Trump. They want to lead that towards perhaps into their corner, perhaps, but that's their goal. The last choice would obviously be Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson, I'm not going to say that he's a perfect libertarian. I don't think anyone is saying that he is the most ideological, libertarian. He was a governor whose perspective was classically liberal. And that's really what he is, that's what he represents. And so what he represents for the future of libertarianism would be a centrist, moderate libertarian party that's more like the Liberal Democrats in the UK, I'd say. It's a centrist party. It's one that looks towards bending policy towards pro-markets, towards drug reform. It's moderate decisions, but again, they're not fully libertarian in the sense of the philosophy being completely digested and understood. So with those three choices, I think Gary Johnson would be, it's something that should be considered. I'd be happy if the GOP after Trump becomes more Liberty Caucus based and Thomas Massie and Rand Paul and Justin Amash, they lead the GOP going forward. That'd be fine. I would also be fine with Ron Paul, continuing his kind of work in moving libertarianism further as a philosophy. But I'd also be fine with Gary Johnson creating a moderate coalition, one that would advance the cause of reforming our drug policy, reining in our foreign policy, one that is very open to the market, pro-market, one that has that liberal perspective on our politics, and one that would be able to work bipartisanship in advancing those causes. So there's no problem with supporting Gary Johnson at all, I don't think. If Hillary or Trump wins, then there's nothing new, right? The GOP and the Democrats, they've always been the main parties. If Gary Johnson wins, that'd be great. We'd be able to move forward as a centrist party. I think that is a positive for libertarians. I think it was a necessary rebranding. And another question I'd like to pose, though, is we want a libertarian movement. We want to move that over to window. How do we do that? What's it look like? I think it will have to look like a centrist party. I don't think you can ramrod through just libertarianism as its full philosophy as perhaps Rothbard would know it. Another thing that I would like to point out is that Rothbard's philosophy that formed the Libertarian Party comes about in what, the 70s, 60s? Prior to that, Hayek, we would consider a libertarian. The reason why people were classically liberal libertarian before that was because they believed in the power of free people, not exactly in the same sense that Rothbard had laid out in his philosophy, but in the sense of the liberal ideology. And I think we should not limit libertarianism to Rothbard's ideology necessarily. I think we should keep it open towards simply what is the liberal, moving forward ideology for libertarians.
All right, does that conclude your introduction statement, Calvin?
Yep.
All right, let me just reset my clock here. Okay, so that concludes the first round, the introduction statement. So now we're going to move on to round number 2, in which I will be asking you two the same question each, and you will both have 3 minutes to respond and have 3-minute rebuttals. Now, I've seen a number of self-identified libertarians come out over the weeks supporting things such as TPP, United Nations, the carbon tax, mandatory vaccinations, even gun control to some degree. So after the Ron Paul revolution we saw in 2012, which attracted millions to libertarianism and in fact turned many into anarcho-capitalists, I have to ask here, is Gary Johnson moving us in the right direction or the wrong direction? And I'll start with Calvin, 3 minutes.
Well, considering where we are, it's not very hard to move towards a libertarian direction. I think we have to consider our priorities. For me, the priority for me is let's find a way to keep the markets open and free. I am a strong believer in entrepreneurship and that approach to the market, and so a presidential candidate who can support entrepreneurship and the free market, that's already great. Obviously, we might all want someone who is like Ron Paul. Obviously, we want Ron Paul, but I'm talking about the circumstances here. Additionally, a big priority for me is drug policy reform. I think we just need, that is a huge priority that we should be working with, even across the aisle especially. I mean, criminal justice reform. I mean, Rand Paul's working on that with Cory Booker. Things like that, things that move us forward. I think any motion forward is good. And, Gary Johnson moves us forward in a way that's digestible for the main public. And again, it's not like we are losing too much. The opportunity cost of supporting Gary Johnson really isn't all that crazy. I mean, I remember, Chris opened up with talking about how the opportunity cost of supporting Gary Johnson would be not being able to support local candidates. I think you can do everything. You can do all of this together. Gary Johnson just represents it at the most forefront national stage at this point. And I think it's a good idea to talk about those policies, things that open us towards libertarianism. Now, obviously not in its full scale, obviously not an anarcho-capitalist, but towards libertarianism, moving that Overton window and working bipartisanship into finding ways forward, moving into that direction.
All right, and Chris, the question now goes to you. Do you think that Gary Johnson is moving us in the right direction or the wrong direction? 3 minutes.
Well, I don't think he's moving us in the right direction. I found a couple things in my opponent's opening statement that were contradictory. The first and foremost being that he said when he was talking about if Trump got elected and Rand and Massey were behind that, and that it'd be a good thing if we could get a Trump president with a strong Republican Liberty caucus in the House and in Congress in general. But then he goes on to say that if Trump or Clinton gets elected, nothing changes at all. So I was wondering why he said that in one statement. Trump's going to be good if the Republican Liberty caucus gets in charge, and then the next statement he said, no, nothing's going to change if Trump gets elected, which in my opinion is why candidates like Rand and Massey obviously don't support Gary Johnson because they know he doesn't have a chance. They can see that they might as well do something to support power, and they know to get elected because how good campaign is run and how good candidate is. But moving on from there, he said we should make libertarianism a more centrist party, and I have to wonder what that entails, because a centrist party in the U.S. is the Democratic Party. You know, it's compared to the rest of the world, it supports a regulated, not necessarily socialist, but mixed economy. It supports, which is somewhat free. It supports drug reform. It supports gun control to some extent, like Bill Weld says, common sense gun control acts. You know, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld have said, well, Bill Weld has said no one on the no-fly list should be able to have guns, and then he goes onto, I forgot the name of the program, but I wrote an article about it on the Libertarian Republic, and he says, Gary Johnson and I have common ground on gun control. So again, you have to wonder what that means. I'm just honestly wondering why, if the Johnson people want a centrist party, a moderate party, they don't just join the Democrats and try to reform them to make some more free market control, because then you've already got the most popular party in the United States under your wing, and you can try influencing it from there. But Gary Johnson seems to be trying to do this weird thing where he's flirting with the Democrats.
Your thought there, Chris? That's 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. So I'm done.
Did you want to just finish your thought real quick?
Well, he's trying to make a half Democrat, half libertarian party and go all the way with it.
All right, Calvin, you have 3 minutes to rebut that.
Well, I guess to the first point, I wasn't saying that whether or not Trump or Hillary win, that nothing would happen. I said if Trump or Hillary win, then that's just the same. It's Republican winning, Democrat winning. It'll lead us towards some kind of goal. And plus, Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, if they pick up the GOP afterwards, it's not fully libertarian still. That's why when you are picking at Gary Johnson's, not perfect libertarian scorecard here, Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, they don't even identify as libertarians. They are Republicans first and foremost. I do enjoy their work moving forward, but I'm not saying that. One, I'm not saying that they're not mutually exclusive, and secondly, I think Gary Johnson's centrist party. So I guess I'll move on to the second part. Gary Johnson's centrist libertarian party would not be like the Democrats. You point out how the Democrats are the Democrats, and they are the centrist party compared to the rest of the world. I was pointing out how the Libertarian Party would form a centrist party that would bridge the gap between the Republicans and the Democrats, and move forward on the issues that are bipartisan towards libertarianism, like drug policy reform. Being able to bridge that gap and moving forward on that policy would be huge. Alone, that policy alone would be great. Moving forward on a less interventionist policy, foreign policy, that too, that would be great. I try to see things as piecemeal, honestly, because if Democrats are supporting the free trade, I'm happy about that. And I hope a lot of libertarians are. I hope a lot of libertarians are happy that we can move forward and move that Overton window to our corner, even if the people who support it may not entirely be libertarian. I understand that there is a danger to supporting someone who isn't fully libertarian, in the sense that if we support them, they might raise taxes, but we get the trade-off of that thing. But I mean, that's always the card we're always dealt with. We are always dealt with those cards. We are always dealt with political realism. And I don't think that pointing that out in Gary Johnson's case is necessarily helpful, nor is it's kind of like a baseline. So for Gary Johnson and the more centrist Libertarian Party that would move forward on libertarian issues that can be a place in our politics for that kind of stuff, I think that'd be good.
All right, Chris, you got 3 minutes for a rebuttal.
Okay, I was just going to draw out essentially what my opponent was saying, because I noticed he said he wants a more centrist party between the Republicans and the Democrats. So essentially what you have here is you've got, I've drawn it out, you've got, I don't know if you guys can see that, you've got the blue, It's too bright. But anyway, the political compass, you've got on it, you've got the blue center, which is the Democrats, and you've got the red. Let me turn the brightness down on this if I can. You've got the red to the right, which is the Republicans. And normally in the bottom right quadrant of this spectrum, you've got the Libertarians. And he's bringing it, and he wants to bring it to this weird area where it's right in between the red and the blue. And again, I just don't see why that's. You're going to get something that isn't libertarianism, or isn't libertarian, or isn't inherently pro-free market. It's not going to be something that's distinguishable from the two parties. Essentially, what you're going to try to do is throw an L into the mix, or a gold into the mix, and it's not really going to. He said we got a goal if a Republican or a Democrat gets elected, at least. But in my perspective, you don't have a goal at all if a Libertarian gets elected. All you've got is a few L's in Congress if you're lucky, or a president, and then you've got a still majority House Republican, majority House Democrat. And historically, you can see the slowest change and the least change, the least progress occurs when you've got Congress that's one party and a president that's another. When most change obviously occurs is when you've got all of something as one color. So, in my opinion, trying to influence it on the federal level, as he said, it's a forefront of why you should support Gary Johnson, isn't necessarily a good idea, because impacting federal policy at this point is such a nightmare. It's going to take years and probably decades to get anywhere done. So you can do both. You can try to do both. You can tacitly support Gary Johnson, I guess. But in my opinion, he's not an actual libertarian, and you shouldn't do it. There's several reasons, as you'll admit. He's not perfect, or he's not pure to very much of an extent, but but still, you could spend a lot more time supporting someone who is pure and who you can influence the outcome of. In my opinion, Gary Johnson's not that person on any level whatsoever. Even if you do believe in supporting the federal, the forefront of the federal election, he's not that person anyways. And chances are he's not going to get elected.
All right, and that is going to conclude this round here. So we're now going to move on to round number 3, in which Calvin is going to get to ask Chris any one question, and Chris will get 3 minutes to respond. And Calvin will be able to have a rebuttal to that. Calvin, you have a question for Chris? Your mic's off.
Yeah, your mic's muted.
Yeah. All right. I guess what would a good motion forward for libertarians look like? I honestly do not. I personally have not gotten a real good answer from anyone who is on the ANCAP side. I'd like to know what your perspective is on what would look like a good movement forward.
Well, in my opinion, I'm not a central planner, and I can't control everyone. And the thing that libertarians are trying to do right now is control everyone. You should get on board with Gary Johnson. You should do this. You should try to take the reins and throw everyone behind this movement. But what I'm advocating for is not that any one thing. I want people to do their own thing. If you want to homestead and you want to practice agorism or live off the system, I'd encourage that. If you want to participate in the local elections, if you want to try to influence local policy, I'd really support that, because I've tried to do it. If you want to try to leave or move to a different country because this one's going to hell in a handbasket, I support that as well. But to answer your question, I think a conjunction of those would actually be a good idea, because there's not any one thing. No one person's going to save you. No one person's going to stop this cliff that we're going off of, and to think Gary Johnson is ridiculous. You know, the man, if he gets elected, what's going to happen, the best case scenario is you're still going to have a Republican Congress, majority Republican, minority Democrat, chances are, and they're going to propose a bunch of laws that he's going to veto, and if we're lucky, he'll get some nice executive orders in. But still, even if he did have reigns over it, and even if that wasn't the scenario, even if he could get what he wanted passed through a bunch of Republicans and Democrats who don't like him, even if, you know, if you think it's so hard for Obama to get what he wants through, and there's gridlock in Congress, just imagine if there's a, you know, like even third outside factor that neither of the parties like. Absolutely nothing's going to get done in that sense. So, you know, but to throw that away, say he does get what he wants done, Johnson is not going to do everything that's libertarian, and he's got some bad policies and some bad ideas. So, in my opinion, to answer your question, it's not to support the president. It's to support local efforts that you yourself can actually influence, not try to get other people to influence. Do what you can instead of trying to get other people, you know, to change things. That's my answer.
All right, Calvin, do you want to have a rebuttal to that real quick?
Yeah. A lot of that didn't seem to be related to actually like Gary Johnson in any sense, really. I know that my question was about Gary Johnson essentially, but it wasn't like Gary Johnson supporters are only myopic about this and like Gary Johnson will change everything. We ran into that with Ron Paul all the time. I honestly don't think you were picking at the right people. I think everyone who is a libertarian in your sense already knows, yeah, voting is very small mathematically, doesn't do anything, and so fighting against that is kind of on your end a waste of energy because it's just people engaging in the national political culture. So I don't think any of that was like exactly even mutually exclusive from moving forward into libertarian goals at all. So it's not like that got in the way of anything. It just seems like you could add on those ideas. You know, obviously being your own entrepreneur, having your own, I guess, agrarian setup for your lifestyle, anything like that. You know, I think that's just additional. And supporting Gary Johnson is not, in the sense, limited. It's just supporting Gary Johnson. So yeah.
All right, Chris, did you want to rebut that real quick?
Yeah, I noticed how he said, oh, I'm not hitting the right people because I'm advocating against voting, and voting is such a small part of it. That's not actually at all what I said. I said you should vote. You should vote in local elections that you can influence.
Right,
I'm not advocating that everyone. Hold on. I'm talking. I didn't say that you should not vote, or you should just go out in the woods and do your own agrarian thing. If you want to, you can. I'm saying you can't control other people, and you can't centrally plan an election like this. All you can do is actually control what you're going to do. So if you see a local candidate, you absolutely should vote for them.
I'll just say it one more time. Again, I don't see how that's mutually exclusive. That's what I was pointing at.
Well.
That's not mutually exclusive.
Well, you know, it kind of is, because if you're spending all day on Facebook hoping that Johnson's going to get elected and shelling like many of these people do, then you're not actually going out and supporting local campaigns. And there's a reason why the Libertarian Party doesn't have very much local sway in very many state offices, is because people don't go out and support the local candidates. So if they did, maybe that would change.
All right, let's move on to the next round here, in which I'm again going to ask these two gentlemen the same question here, and they will have 3 minutes each to answer and then rebut.
Justin, did you forget the part where I asked Calvin a question?
Yeah, we'll do that after this part here.
Okay, all right, sounds fair.
All right, so for this round, now I feel like some of the arguments that both of you guys are making here, more so on Calvin's end, is that it's centered around the idea that it is possible for the Libertarian Party to win at the federal level and enact some sort of change even though they've made very little progress through their 45-year history, and they currently hold 0 seats in the federal government. And Gary got less than 1% of the vote in 2012. So my question for you guys is this. Since there probably is a very slim opportunity of Gary Johnson winning the White House this year, should Gary be watering down the message and running on the platform of creating bipartisanship in order to make change? Or should he instead be taking the opportunity to spread the pure libertarian message, as Ron Paul did? And we'll start with Chris here, 3 minutes.
Well, I think he should do what Ron Paul did. I mean, this election, what Ron Paul did was he presented it in a way that attracted young people in a much better way. He was charismatic. He was a government figure. He had a lot of connections, and he run a brilliant campaign. But Gary Johnson, when someone from the outside looks at the libertarian movement now as opposed to in 2012, say, what they see is they see a bunch of people who are infighting. And they see that movement that can't make up its mind. And I know some people are going to say, well, that's because of the Never Johnson people. But regardless, like I said, he's not a unifying figure, and that's what a leader should be. So Ron Paul was much more of a unifying figure. You didn't see a bunch of you did to some extent, but you didn't see as much of a fringe movement back in 2012 as you do now. Some people sure said, oh, Ron Paul supporters are a bunch of conspiracy nuts, but for the large part, you had a lot of people who normally wouldn't look twice at libertarianism who say, you know what, I like Ron Paul. He seems like he's the anti-war candidate. He seems like he's against the big business interests. So I think I'll throw my hat in the Republican ring this time and vote for Ron Paul. I think he did a much better idea of it. He did a much better job of it. He had better ideas, and he was more ideologically pure in the process. So this idea we have to moderate and try to appeal to the other side isn't a good idea, because people can detect. Humans have an ability to detect flaws and weaknesses and inauthenticity and basically the whole 9 yards. And they look at someone like Johnson and they see someone who's trying to get the Jill Stein vote. And you could go on Now This, for example, and read the comments whenever they show a Gary Johnson video. And 90% of them, I guarantee you, are going to say something like, if it's an old one, they'll say, you know what, I like what Gary's trying to do, but I think I'm going to go with Bernie. Or I like what he's trying to do, but I think I'm going to go with Stein. They don't see someone who's authentic. They see someone who's trying to pander to them. That's why they're going to go with someone who is more authentic to them. So you should stay true to your message. Stay true to your fans, and instead of alienating them to get other votes, you should really double down on them and try to set a good example, because that's what a good campaign's about.
All right, and Calvin, the question now goes over to you. Should Gary continue running with the same message that he is right now, or should he instead be spreading the pure libertarian message as Ron Paul did?
You asked the question saying that the Libertarian Party has little chance of winning. Totally agree with that. I don't think anyone's trying to be pull the wool over anyone's eyes. Let's be clear-eyed about it. Definitely, the Libertarian Party is a very hard time winning, if any. I think what the Libertarian Party needs to do is rebranding. Obviously, as much as we may love Ron Paul, he got me involved. And as much as I think Gary Johnson is lacking, he's definitely lacking in many ways. I don't think that his message is necessarily wrong. His message is different from Ron Paul. I think the best way to look at it is when they answered the same question in 2012. Ron Paul they were both asked about the drug war, and Ron Paul gave more deontological, rights-based issue approach to it. About having the right to choose and all that stuff, really great, philosophical libertarian stuff. Gary Johnson answered that with more of a centrist, applicable, empirical answer. I think both answers are good, but Gary Johnson answered it with the sense of let's apply it as a health issue, not a criminal issue, things like that, where it's more applicable to a wider audience. And I think there is a need to remarket libertarianism in such a way. I think we do need to remarket libertarianism away, not away from rights, but with additional help of saying, look, we are the radical moderate. People do agree that we should have choice. We should have better drug policy, less foreign intervention, and picking up those topics. I'm saying it's about our principles informing our values and informing our I guess our laundry list of policies of what we really want. What I really want is drug policy reform. That's a big one that targets communities. We should really focus on that foreign policy. We should really focus on the free market. And so for Gary Johnson, I'm not going to say he's perfect. I don't think anyone's saying he's perfect. But I'm not going to say that he's pandering or he's wrong. I believe, Chris, you brought up Now This video. That's kind of weird because you're picking up an audience that is Now This. I don't think that's applicable to, that's not good evidence. You're picking up a sample size that is the Now This audience. I don't think that's very applicable to this sense. I've actually seen a lot of people who have come to the libertarian side and understanding that it can be an option to support peace, but also drug reform, but also criminal justice reform, the open and free market, entrepreneurship, those kind of things. And I think that's a good rebranding that I don't think we should discount. I don't think that's bad.
All right, just at the 3-minute mark. Chris, you'll have 3 minutes to respond.
Well, first off, the Now This audience, if you think about Now This, who follows it, they mostly young people who don't know a ton about politics, who are just getting involved, and who saw a video that they made about technology or something, and they said, you know what, I think I'll follow this page. So, you know, it's a left-leaning audience, and that's absolutely a trying to get right now. Obviously, the Bernie Sanders audience, the people, you know, the millions of people who don't like Hillary or Trump. That's who you're trying to get, and that's the Now This audience. And a lot of them like Jill Stein better. But secondly, you brought up Gary Johnson in 2012, and you said, oh well, Gary Johnson's trying to get a more wide audience, better audience. You know, it's better to rebrand it and make it more mainstream and cookie cutter. But the funny thing is, Ron Paul actually won most of the straw polls in the 2012 election, and he actually got a lot farther in the Republican race than Gary Johnson did, and he was more ideologically pure, as you'll admit. So this, again, people don't like inauthenticity. They don't like the politicians who are trying to get their vote. They like the politicians who stick to their guts and who have 20, 30-year records of voting for principle, voting on the same thing. Those are the politicians everyone likes. They don't like the guy who's going to say whatever they can to get your vote. They like the guy who's going to you know, vote for his principles no matter if it's right or wrong. And that's what Ron Paul's appeal was. He was the guy who stood against the Iraq War when it wasn't popular. He was the guy who fought for you know, gay and lesbian rights when it wasn't popular. He was the guy that you know, stood for his principle for 20, 30 years. And a lot of people find that attractive, and I'd say a lot more people respect that than the guy who's willing to say whatever he can to reach more people and to get a bigger audience. Now going back, I think Gary Johnson, if he really wanted to really solidify his movement, he would actually become a more unifying people in the party and would look at the people in the party who are saying, I'm leaving libertarianism because of this guy. Because, you know, an actual leader is a guy that people from both sides of the aisle will look at and say, you know what, I will, you know, both sides of a particular audience, like libertarians, will say, you know what, this is my candidate, because I think he's going to stick to what he says and do what he says, not the guy who's going to have half the people saying, oh, I hate Johnson, half the people saying I like him, and then Johnson in the meantime isn't focusing on his demographic he's trying to grow. A house divided isn't going to stand against itself, and Johnson's divided this house pretty far against you know, itself, and I don't think we're going to be able to get the Green vote and be able to get the Independent vote, and we're going to be able to get the Republican and Democrat vote when we can't even get our own vote.
Ding, 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 ding. Go ahead and just finish that thought there.
I did. Perfect timing.
All right. Calvin, did you want to rebut before we move on to the next round here?
Yeah, sure. Well, like when you pointed out Gary Johnson's not so great performance in 2012, I don't think that's attributable to just that he was not rights-based or wasn't exactly Ron Paul. I think a lot of it has to do more with Ron Paul being already a big name by then. You know, well, slightly big name. He had run in 2008. He was a congressman for 12 terms. There's a lot more to it than I think you're pointing at. Secondly, I don't think that it's a right idea to. I don't think you're correct in painting him as inauthentic. I really don't think Gary Johnson's inauthentic. He really isn't. He's not read in the same sense of like Ron Paul. Ron Paul he's definitely well read in the sense of reading a lot of Austrian stuff, a lot of Rothbard, Mises, Hayek. He knows his stuff. Gary Johnson has never painted himself to be, that he's a philosophical champion or anything like that. What he has championed is being a libertarian perspective, one of a governing with a libertarian perspective. The best thing that I could pull up, the best thing that I would bring up is that Thomas Jefferson, in the sense that Thomas Jefferson, he's not a libertarian, he's a classical liberal. He wanted to support France in the war. He fought the Barbary pirates. He bought the Louisiana Purchase kind of thing. He's not a full libertarian, but he governed with the perspective of classical liberal values, one that looked forward, one that looked towards the independence and individualism of liberalism. I want to say that Gary Johnson is in that similar vein, where he's governing. His whole perspective of libertarianism is to govern with good government. That's his whole book. If you read his book, it's actually pretty good. But it's about governing with the perspective of individual choice, coming to choice, and finding what the best role of the government is. And so I don't think we should make any bones about it that he's just some kind of ideological, dumbass or anything like that, or just completely insincere. He really is sincere. He's just not on the same paradigm as Ron Paul. And then I guess you pointed out a lot of stuff about how he can't unite, he can't grab this and that. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the Never Johnson group is the one that is kind of dividing it in that sense. But okay, I don't want to say anyone should support someone they don't really believe in. I think the biggest issue with that argument was that it kind of applies to every national election. And if you're in that sense, then you're right. No one can unite everyone, 100%. Obviously, we see that, but I just wouldn't want to say that that's the argument that should discount Johnson and not someone else. That would discount anyone. That's all I gotta say.
All right, and so we're going to move on to the next round here, in which Chris will get to ask Calvin any one question. Calvin will have 3 minutes to respond. Go ahead, Chris.
My question to Calvin would be, what would it take for Gary Johnson to lose your support?
Pretty simple. If he were to suddenly stop supporting drug policy reform, if he were to suddenly turn back on everything about the free market. He does have a great free market perspective, honestly, like a normal free market perspective. It's not perfect, and I don't want to say it's anarcho-capitalist or anything like that, but it is an approach to understanding market processes and things like that. If he were to suddenly become a very staunch foreign policy interventionist, you might bring up his 2012 stint, but that was honestly such a weird off-the-cuff moment. I don't really see that as his personality as something that he would govern with. But it would take those major things. It would take things that would say, libertarians who have championed, LGBT rights, who have championed drug policy reform, who have championed foreign policy, championed a free market. If he were to turn on very big things like that, then he would lose my support. Him looking at the legal precedents behind public accommodation laws is a smart thing for him. I don't want to discount that. And for some people that turned them off from it because it is a problem with freedom of association and discrimination. But I look at the big things. I think a lot of Johnson supporters are looking at the big things, and they want those bigger policies moved forward on. They want bipartisanship on those issues to move forward. Because, like Gary Johnson has said, if Clinton or Trump are elected, politics on the national stage will be more polarized. I totally agree with that, and I think that would be a detriment to moving our policies forward, especially if we have the chance right now with Johnson, as small of a chance as it may be, to at least move forward on those big policies.
Okay, so do I get a rebuttal?
Yep, go ahead, Chris.
Okay, so you said a few things. If he doesn't support a free trade stance, if he stopped drug reform, and if he became a military interventionist. I want to go off of what Ron Paul Senior Institute fellow Adam Dick said about the Johnson-Weld ticket, and he said that if elected, Johnson and Weld would probably govern as co-presidents, basically. They both seem to be, they go everywhere together. They both answer questions. One person answers one, the next person answers the next. They give off the vibe. Essentially, this is what I feel, at least, and a lot of other people, like this guy from the Ron Paul Institute, noticed that they do a lot of the same stuff together. And so Weld has said, for example, Johnson and I have common ground on gun control, for instance, which is something you didn't mention would lose his support. But anyway, Johnson said in the first CNN town hall that he would keep all drugs illegal, except for maybe marijuana. So in that sense, you should have already stopped supporting Johnson because of what he said about the matter publicly. In addition, his running mate, Bill Weld, who we've established, at least I think we've established, that is influential on Johnson, has said that Johnson wants to, or that we should have a supremacist military around the world. And Stossel in the CNN, or the Stossel town hall on this Friday, and he wants to support Israel as well, more nation building, more foreign aid. And then you mentioned trade, which he supports off and on, admittedly, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is 54,000 pages of rules and regulations with other countries. So I don't see how that's free trade whatsoever. So in my opinion, you should have stopped supporting Johnson a while ago. I don't know if you're just willing to let these things pass, if you think these things are libertarian or free trade, or if you're just not paying attention to them. But in my opinion, Johnson, by your own standards, isn't a candidate you should support.
Oof. Calvin, you want to go ahead and respond to that?
Yeah. His comments on drug policy have always been well documented. He has supported the decriminalization and the legalization of marijuana, and he has said that that would be moving our society forward, light years toward understanding the freedom of choice. Just simply decriminalizing and descheduling that drug would move us forward as a culture. And yeah, I think you're forgetting a lot of the president as a cultural figurehead. I think you're really discounting that, and that is a big thing. And then additionally, the thing is on foreign policy. There's no foreign policy in a libertarian sense. There is no pure foreign policy, and I don't think Gary Johnson is that far off from a general libertarian standpoint, because the libertarian philosophy, depending on who you are, I personally think it's a strong defense. Of course, it is a securing of the personal rights. It is a securing of the national borders in some sense of defense, and I don't think you can say that there's any plausible fully libertarian foreign policy that you could enact. I think the best one would be to limit our foreign intervention, especially stopping the regime change as a big tenet of it, and those kind of things. So I really don't think the comments on foreign policy really are that big. I think you were picking up on myopic topics. And then what was the last one you picked up? Sure.
The TPP?
Yeah, I think the TPP is good. I think it is free trade. I think a lot of the fear around it is that it is long, it's huge. Well, the problem is there's no realistic political circumstance where you can just drop all tariffs and expect nothing and expect the best outcome. What the point of these free trade agreements is to unilaterally compare and standardize regulations. And since we have regulations, you kind of have to do that. Additionally, it is free trade. It is pro-trade. It is greater access to larger markets, especially for the world's poorest. I don't think the TPP is necessarily not free trade. It's definitely not free trade. It definitely is an opening of markets. It definitely is an opening of trade. And I don't think the libertarians who are anti-TPP fully get the scope of what is necessary in our open trade agreements. So my answer for that in general is just a sense of political realism It's also a sense of cultural motion that a Johnson-Weld presidency would represent. I'm not saying he's perfect. I don't think anyone is saying he's perfect. I don't think anyone should be painting the Johnson-Weld campaign as trying to act like they're perfect or anything or fully libertarian or Rothbardian. I think we should all understand that the Johnson-Weld campaign is about painting a perspective that is fully radically moderate. Is what I'd say.
All right, Chris, you want to respond to that?
I'm just wondering if he's read the TPP or he's heard some of the weird things that it says regarding intellectual property, what it says about what companies can do to someone's to community government's rules. If a community decides that cigarettes are illegal, for example, the company can sue them and force them to overturn that rule and statute, which, in my opinion, if a community decides that they don't want cigarettes or whatever, the company shouldn't be able to just sue them to force them to be legal. I mean, it's not a particularly good policy in my opinion, but it's something that if those people don't want them, then the company definitely has other options on where to sell. And moving on from that, if you haven't read it, how can you say that be honest. Have you read 5,000 pages of the thing and be able to say yes, it's free trade? Chances are in there's going to be some stuff that you don't like. And if there's this bill that has some things you don't like and some things you do like, do you really want it to pass, or do you really want to try to forge something else that does have a lot of stuff that you do like? In my opinion, even if there was maybe 20-30% of the bill that I didn't like, that's going to be I don't know, maybe 1,000 pages of rules that I don't like. So I wouldn't want a bill that had that anyway. I don't see how that's free trade. But moving on, you did mention that Johnson and Weld want marijuana reform. Well, that's pretty easy to say. That's not that controversial at all. A lot of people want marijuana legal. I mean, you could probably make the argument 70-80% of the country thinks that it's too much of a criminal offense these days. And I think a lot of people. He said he'd keep drugs illegal. Not I'm going to decriminalize them, but help the addicts get better and instead of throwing them in prison, throw them in a rehab. So that's a pretty easy stance to take. He still wants to continue the drug war in that way, not soft on drugs. And you try to make the argument that the president is a cultural figurehead, which might be true, but it's just you haven't really provided anything other than saying, oh, the TPP is free trade. He wants to get rid of drugs, therefore he's these are libertarian stances he's taking. I just think personally he's watering down the message. He is watering it down and trying to seem as uncontroversial as possible. And in my opinion, because he's doing that, he's not going to get any major changes passed that libertarians want. I mean, if he's willing to compromise on these issues, what's he willing to compromise on things like taxes or guns or any number of other issues? Those are my concerns.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next round here. Just to keep time going, I'm going to ask another question. You'll each have 3 minutes to answer it, and then we'll move on to some fan questions from the YouTube chat. And we'll start with Calvin here. My question for you guys is, does having Bill Weld on the ticket hurt or help Gary Johnson's credibility?
To libertarians, it obviously hurts it. But I think to the wider world, it definitely helps. That's about it. I mean, people who aren't libertarians enjoy him because he speaks a lot better, and secondly, he's a lot more moderate. He's something that they can expect. But obviously, to libertarians, that's not so great. I'm not going to sit around and defend him exactly. He is what he is. I don't know. There's nothing I can say that would be like, oh yeah, he's fully libertarian. He's like Gary Johnson, where he governs with the same perspective of moving forward towards a classically liberal policy. So yeah.
All right, so the question goes over to you, Chris. Do you think that having Bill Weld on the ticket hurts or helps Gary Johnson's credibility?
Well, I'm sure as most people guessed I was going to answer, it hurts it. I think that Gary Johnson actually has called Bill Weld the OG libertarian. I believe was the original libertarian, something like that. He said in a debate, and you know, if Johnson thinks that's the model libertarian, you got to wonder what Johnson's ideas are going to actually be like once he starts influencing them and listening to Bill Weld more. And again, you have Bill Weld saying things like Johnson and I have a common ground on gun control. You've got, you know, people speculating that they're going to run as co-presidents. That these people, you can tell that they obviously listen to each other a lot. They're each other's close advisors, as many presidential tickets are. So, in my opinion, it's not only hurting his credibility, it's hurting his policy, and it's hurting his. It's scary to think what Weld, who says handguns are more dangerous than rifles, than automatic rifles, and that might not be the exact comment, but that's the effect of it, that handguns are dangerous and that we should restrict them. You know, I agree with Calvin for the most part. He's not necessarily appealing to libertarians, but in my opinion, it does hurt it among moderates, because you've got a bunch of people, when the moderates see the Libertarian Party arguing over the vice presidential candidate of all things, they're not going to like it. They're not going to say this party knows what it's doing. These people are together. So in my opinion, it doesn't. He's wrong in the sense that it's appealing to moderates, because it looks really bad when we nominate someone we can't really agree is a libertarian. So. And those, but moderates that you're speaking of that he would appeal to are probably voting for Trump or Clinton anyways, which Bill Weld has hinted that he thinks you should do. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on Bill Weld.
All right, we'll move on to some fan questions from the YouTube chat now. This first question, it comes from Nicholas Amato, and he wants to know, how should we approach selecting another candidate in 2020 as a party? And what kind of a candidate should we look for, and who would that be ideally in your view? And we'll start with Chris here.
Well, I put out a meme on Liberty Hangout the other day, and my ideal president would probably be someone like Tom Woods. And now, again, maybe people don't want to know Tom Woods, or don't want to go with someone who's such a radical, open, outspoken anarchist like Woods. If he ran for the nomination, I'd definitely support him. But if we're being a little more realistic, maybe I'd support someone like perhaps Peter Schiff. If he ran, I think he'd make a great president. Really understands monetary policy, knows a lot about economics, has a great resume. I think Schiff would be a great president. So really, I think we shouldn't go off of someone just because they, like this time. I've heard Johnson supporters make this argument, and I brought it up in an article I wrote for Libertarian Republic. It was Johnson's got name recognition. People know who he is. People say, oh, Gary Johnson, he was the last presidential nominee. Let's throw him in the ring again. That'd be like if the GOP decided to nominate Mitt Romney this time around. It wouldn't make. It's not such a great idea. The guy's already proven he lost. He got 1% of the vote. I think the GOP was smart enough, and Romney was smart enough to say, you know what, for the good of the party, we should try someone else this time around. I don't think we should nominate someone on name recognition. I think we should nominate them on ideas. And just because someone, and the Democrats did this. In 2008, Clinton had all the name recognition. Everyone knew who she was. Her husband was president, for Christ's sake. But Obama won because the Democrats thought he had better ideas going into the primaries. So they did good on that, in my opinion. Not necessarily picking a good president, but picking a good candidate for themselves. And Obama ran a wonderful campaign, too. He got a lot of moderates, a lot of people that didn't like where the economy was going. He was a good candidate for them. So in this time around, Johnson isn't a good candidate. He's someone who the libertarians don't really like. He's someone who the left sort of says, well, we kind of like where you're going, but we're still going with Stein or Clinton. And the right, they see all this crazy shit he's saying about the wedding cakes and the carbon tax, and then taking that back. And they say, you know what? I don't think I could have a pothead in office, so I'm going to go with Trump or Castle. Johnson's not really getting support from anyone except hardline LP activists. So you could say he's getting 7% in the poll or whatever he is, but that's not going to be enough to get him into the debates. And hardline LP activists and maybe some never Trump people, maybe a Bernie supporter here and there, but again, not a candidate that's going to go mainstream, in my opinion.
Right on the money there. And now the question will go over to Calvin. Calvin, how should we approach selecting another candidate in 2020? What kind of candidate should we look for, and who would that be ideally in your view?
Well, I guess it depends on the cycle. The reason why this cycle Gary Johnson would be a great choice, honestly, is because of the other two candidates. There's just no other chance to have a approachable, moderate, centrist person who would be somewhat electable. I mean, I think a lot of libertarians forget, and I think we've been pampered a lot for the last few years, that we've always had ideological people because it's just possible. There's no cost to having an ideological person when you know you're not going to lose. This time around, I think it was a smart idea to put Johnson in because the other two candidates were just terrible. And I think that's where you're wrong to say that Johnson is only getting support from hard LP activists, considering if last time he was getting 1%, and that's with hardline LP activists. This time he's getting around 10%. There's a lot more people involved. There's a lot of people. He's getting a lot of different people. I think you're just entirely wrong to say that 10% is just LP activists or something like that. And additionally, the points that you're making about how he can't get the other people, I think that applies to any candidate because they're not going to support a libertarian just because they're not libertarians. So those arguments were just not fitting. Those would fit in any person. The LP should always, the point of a political party is to put up candidates who are electable. We forget that as libertarians a lot, especially when it comes to this. But for the presidential candidate, obviously, I think that would be a great chance to put up an ideological figurehead, mainly if the other candidates and the Democrats and the Republicans are pretty doable, as if they're going to win. And if the Libertarian Party is not going to win, we may as well have a spokesperson. But in the sense that if we do have the opportunity to win, then we should definitely put someone who's electable. I mean, to each his own, really. It's the Libertarian Party, not the entirety of libertarians. I don't have the best finite answer. It's up to them.
All right, let's move on to one more question from the chat here. Since, as we can all probably agree on, taxation is theft, our buddy Dan Giles wants to know that if Gary gets 5% in November, should the LP take the money? And what he's asking is that because if the Libertarian Party does hit 5% this November, they'll be eligible to receive X million dollars in federal matching funds. So we'll start here with Calvin. Should the LP take the money if he hits 5%? Should the Libertarian Party take theft?
Essentially, yes. It's rent seeking. The rent is out there. If you don't take it, you're behind with that much money compared to everyone else. Just take it. It's kind of like telling welfare recipients not to take welfare. It's just like, I wish the system didn't exist, obviously. We all wish, the taxation system didn't exist. But for the time being and for the incentives out there and for the institutions that are out there, unless you can really bring up a good reason why the LP should not take, $5 million, I believe it was? If you can come up with a good reason why that would be detrimental to the LP, then I don't know. I think it's fair game because it is fair game established by the government itself. Whatever.
All right. Question goes over to Chris. Should the LP take the money?
This is a really tough question because on one hand, Johnson needs it. Let's be honest. He's hardly getting, like you said, generously. If you're being generous, he's getting 10%. If he wants to make into the debates, obviously they're going to take that money. But in my opinion, probably not, because Johnson's, in my opinion, isn't going to make it. If he can't make it into the debates, he's not getting elected. If they're just taking that money and they're going to use it to line their own pockets and get someone a job, I don't think so. If it was something like 14, 13%, and Johnson was just barely getting, almost going to get there, and time was running out, and we have a real chance, and this is our only way, sure, take it. But in my opinion, right now, no, it's not going to make the cut. It's not going to get him where he needs to be. So I got to be honest and stick with my guts here. I think we should win the battle with ideas, and he should have ran a better campaign. And he shouldn't have the federal government bail him out. Not especially when, if you looked at a bank, a bank, for example, the same principle applies. Hey, we've got all this people's money. We know we gambled, and we know we practiced fractional reserve, and we know we're tanking the economy here, but we really need your money so you don't lose it. More of your money so you don't lose what you have in the bank. I think the primary answer should have just been the bank should have ran things better, so the taxpayers shouldn't bail them out. So I'm going to say no.
All right, and we'll move on to one more round of questions from the YouTube chat before we move on to the closing statements. Now, I know that Calvin earlier was mentioning how he would stick around with supporting Johnson if Johnson was still promoting the drug reform and a non-interventionist foreign policy. And I believe there's one more that you mentioned. So this question comes from, his name is Not a Marxist on YouTube. He wants to know if Jill Stein ran for the LP nomination, if she would get the Johnson fans' support too. We'll start with Chris.
You know what? I bag on Gary Johnson supporters as a lot. When I posed this question, and I said I'm debating against your candidate, I was met with some pretty harsh language. But I got to be honest, I don't think Johnson supporters are that delusional. And I don't think. And I'll say another thing. I don't think the general public is that delusional. Think about this. They are the general public is thinking about supporting an internet meme, Harambe, more so than Jill Stein. So I don't think Johnson supporters are stupid enough to support someone who can't even out-pull Harambe, the dead gorilla. I don't think they're that dumb. So no, I don't think so. Especially with she's an open advocate of socialism and Marxism. I don't think Johnson supporters are there yet.
Well, before we move on to Calvin here, to be fair, Johnson did actually lose to the Sweet Meteor of Death and D's Nuts in one poll.
Oh, so that's true. That's true. Maybe.
He doesn't have that going for him. All right, the question goes over to you now, Calvin. Do you think that if Jill Stein ran for the LP nomination, if she would get the Johnson fan support?
Probably not, because of the whole socialism thing, the whole government control thing that she really loves to tout around about limiting corporations, that kind of rhetoric. I think we also have to remember, I know the question's being posed to say how fickle the Johnson supporters might be or how flaky they are. I think it's important to recognize that Ron Paul supporters, as many of them were real libertarians, a lot of them this time around went to Trump. A lot of them went to Sanders. His support base wasn't entirely just his own libertarians. So I think in the nature of democracy, you're bringing together a lot of different people anyway. But if Jill ran for the LP, she would definitely pick up a lot of good support.
All right, and we are about to move on to the final round, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are ready. So now we are going to start with the closing statements, and Calvin will go first. You have 5 minutes to tell us why it is still a wise idea to support Gary Johnson for president.
It all comes down to priorities, and it just comes down to priorities and what's possible. I think what Chris said about he's not controversial. He won't say anything controversial or things like that. I don't think that's a problem. Do we want a candidate who's just entirely controversial? The whole point, the controversial point, is not exactly a value it's not exactly a positive or a negative. It's just not a value to have. I think what Gary Johnson presents is a chance to move forward on libertarian issues. Obviously, not to the full extent. Obviously, you brought up, Gary Johnson's not going to legalize heroin and meth and all that stuff. I wouldn't even want that at this point in time. That would have a major backlash. But what Gary Johnson presents is a case to move forward on those issues. Remember, he is a perspective on governance, is what I see. It's a motion forward on opening free markets, on vetoing as much crony capitalistic legislation as possible. I know you might bring up the TPP, but I think the TPP is a great opportunity to move forward on free trade, especially with large parts of the world that are not able to access markets, especially my nationality, well, not nationality, my heritage of Vietnam. There's a lot of benefits and possibilities that would move forward with the Johnson candidacy, a Johnson presidency, that I don't think you could get with just an ideological figurehead. Obviously, I don't think anyone is saying Gary Johnson is the perfect libertarian, and I think that's what a lot of this conversations come down to: how he's just not perfect enough, how he's not the figurehead of Tom Woods or Peter Schiff or Ron Paul, and I don't think that should be entirely a discount in the sense of there's no possibility of libertarianism without those figureheads. The possibility of libertarianism is to move forward on personal choice, on freedom, on classical liberal values, and I think moving forward on those major issues, keeping the markets open, finding ways to restoring property rights, of reforming our criminal justice system, of ending the drug war, of bringing our troops home. Those kind of policy initiatives are libertarian, and we just want to move forward on that. I want to take it on a piecemeal basis, and I want to move that Overton window to our corner. And I think Gary Johnson is a definite move forward for that. He definitely would have the benefit of moving forward with the bipartisanship that he's working for. If we've got the bipartisan support for those kind of policies, I would be happy. I think a lot of libertarians should be happy about that, even if Gary Johnson's not Rothbard incarnate. And yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
All right, so now we go on to Chris. You have 5 minutes to tell us why it is not a wise idea to still be supporting Gary Johnson, and then that will conclude tonight's debate.
Well, thank you for having me on the program. Thank you for everyone who listened, and thank you, Nick, for asking me that question. I think my opponent brought up Johnson's shouldn't, it's not a good idea to support someone just because they're controversial or just because they say controversial things. But, I mean, on one hand, you could say that. On the other hand, you can say, well, it is appealing to a lot of people. A lot of people like the guy who's going to go out and say wacky, crazy things and is going to say things that, are refreshing. Someone who's not necessarily filtered by popularity. That's where Trump's whole appeal comes from. Not saying you should say what Trump says, but you can learn a lot from how he's campaigning. And on the other hand, still, whenever I bring up, we should support state and local candidates, I always hear instead of the presidential candidate, especially if you live in a hardline blue or red state, I always hear, well, you can do both. And the people who say that don't realize that libertarians haven't been doing both. They have only been supporting the president. They have only been maybe following Thomas Massie or Ron Paul or Rand Paul. They haven't been supporting their state and local candidates. Libertarians don't vote and they don't campaign, even campaigning for a good Republican you like, or maybe if you're left-leaning, a bleeding heart libertarian, a Democrat who seems reasonable. They don't do this. They don't. It's a criticism I think a lot of people have of the LP outside of it, and we have to be able to criticize ourselves. A lot of libertarians aren't supporting their local candidates mainly because they're too caught in the hype of the general election, and I think that does need to change. That is an issue, and it just suggests otherwise you're just living in denial. You just go to the Wikipedia page if someone from Europe, for instance, saw our Wikipedia page, they'd be wondering what the hell's happening, because third parties over there do a lot better than ours do, because they have a system in place where it's not winner take all, and they have set it up, and they have activism, and they're more politically involved over there, to where a third party does have a voice at the table. And so, we need to, like, I'll agree with Calvin, we need to definitely rebrand, but we need to make sure we're supporting people that don't have millions of dollars behind them. So that's my closing statement. I don't think it's wise to support Gary Johnson, not just because of the cake or the carbon tax or the gun control or the burqa or whatever other things he's said. I don't think it's wise, also because I think it's a waste of time and money. So that's my opinion on why you shouldn't support Gary Johnson. You should find someone who you can support and can make a difference toward.
All right, and that's going to wrap it up for tonight's debate. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming on to the show tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I think this is definitely a very inquisitive look into the presidential election and into Gary Johnson in particular, and hopefully it helped some of our viewers who may be on the fence about whether or not they want to vote for him. And thank you guys so much for tuning into the Liberty Hangout podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the Liberty Hangout podcast on iTunes. Subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're here tonight. Like us on Facebook. Follow on Twitter at Liberty Hangout. Make sure you go like our two new sister sites, Sports Hangout and Tech Hangout, for all the sports and technology lovers out there. And make sure to check out libertyhangout.org to read some awesome liberty-minded material from a great lineup of writers. Thank you guys so much, and we will see you again next time.